Hi everybody. In this unit I'm going to be talking about the autonomic nervous system, and I'm going to try to do that by drawing some comparisons to stuff that we've already talked about in some of our earlier units. In other words, I'll be comparing and contrasting a little bit between the autonomic nervous system, which is the new stuff, and the somatic nervous system, which is all of the motor stuff that we've just finished up with. So I'm going to be making some comparisons between autonomic and somatic, but I'm also going to be making some comparisons within the autonomic nervous system as well. And the reason why I can do that is because the autonomic nervous system has two divisions, the sympathetic division and the parasympathetic division. And as you'll see, each division has a lot in common with the other, but there are some important differences that will become even more important in the next half of the course. Now, once upon a time, people called the autonomic nervous system the visceral nervous system. If you think about what that word visceral really means, it tells you that you're having kind of a gut reaction to something. So if I remind you that we have our last exam coming up next week, some people will have a visceral reaction, making them feel like they want to vomit. Visceral, deep, deep, deep inside. So if you remember that that's the nickname for the autonomic nervous system, it can actually be a helpful reminder that the autonomic nervous system does control a lot of these visceral processes, these core functions of your body. But speaking a little bit more generally, we can say that the autonomic nervous system really controls structures other than skeletal muscle. So even though it has many targets and there's a lot of diversity, the one thing that cuts across everything is that none of them are skeletal muscle. So we can set up our first comparison between the stuff that we've talked about before and the new stuff by thinking a little bit more about these differences. So you might remember from earlier in the course that the somatic nervous system controls voluntary muscle contractions, and that's because skeletal muscle is the voluntary muscle inside the body. So all of those movements that you learned earlier in the course were, for the most part, under conscious control. But thinking about the autonomic nervous system, I can't make my heart beat any faster, even if I think about it really hard. I can't increase my respiration rate. I can't make myself sweat. So all of those things are involuntary. They're not under conscious control. Now, there's always going to be exceptions to everything, right? Nothing is completely binary. So in some cases, like the patellar reflex or the flexor withdrawal reflex, you actually have a situation where skeletal muscle is essentially under involuntary control. But we're not going to talk about those. Instead, we're going to try to keep things as contrasty as possible. And I want you to remember that the autonomic nervous system is involuntary and the somatic nervous system is voluntary. Now, there's also some anatomical differences and some similarities too between the somatic nervous system and the autonomic nervous system. So remember in the last unit when we were talking about the spinal cord sections, we had emphasized that within every spinal section there were motor neurons that were coming out of the central nervous system. And once they come out of the nervous system at the spinal cord, they go out to the periphery and they then go on to innervate skeletal muscle. We also saw that in the diagram that we drew together when we were in class. Now, interestingly, the autonomic nervous system also uses many of the same structures in the spinal cord. So if we were talking about autonomic sensory functions, that information would still come in on the dorsal side. And if we're talking about autonomic motor functions, it's still going out through the ventral side of each spinal cord section. But in this unit, we're not going to talk about any of the autonomic sensory functions. Instead, I'm going to focus only on the motor functions of the autonomic nervous system. And that means that the neurons that I'm going to be talking about are still going to be traveling out through the ventral root, and they'll be heading out to tissues inside the body from there. But again, the key thing with the autonomic nervous system is that those tissues are not skeletal muscle. So the autonomic motor neurons go on to innervate cardiac muscle. That can make it beat faster or slower. They'll go on to innervate smooth muscle, which can be important for contracting or dilating blood vessels or airways. And they can even go to glands to control secretions and metabolic functions inside the body. So as an example of that, your autonomic nervous system can innervate adipocytes or fat tissue and help to control your metabolism. So there's a lot of diversity in terms of the targets, which is why I was mentioned for the umpteenth time that the easiest way to describe them is to say that they're not skeletal muscle. Now, anatomically, if we think about the actual neurons themselves, up to this point, we've been emphasizing that the motor neurons in the somatic division of the nervous system consist of an alpha motor neuron with a single long axon that originates from the spinal cord, right? Goes out through the ventral horn, ventral root. From there, it'll go out to the periphery and ultimately project into a skeletal muscle fiber. Now, if we take it even further and go back to thinking about the NMJ synapse, the synapse between the neuron and the muscle at the neuromuscular junction, we know from before that there's always an excitatory stimulus that's sent through that synapse, right? The neuromuscular junction always has acetylcholine released into it, and the skeletal muscle always responds with its acetylcholine receptors in that all or nothing principle that I talked about before. But if you take a look down at the bottom of this schematic here, you can see the representation of the autonomic neurons. And it's kind of similar, but again, there's a couple of differences. The first difference, which is really important, is that instead of just having a single neuron, the autonomic nervous system almost always has two neurons. And those neurons form a synapse somewhere outside of the nervous system. In other words, the axon terminals of the presynaptic neuron come together with the dendrites and cell body of the postsynaptic neuron. When they come together in this synapse, because it's located in the periphery outside of the central nervous system, that structure is known as a ganglion. And it's that encapsulated structure that you see in the very center of that bottom image. By referencing the ganglion, we can actually come up with the naming convention for the neurons that are involved. There's one presynaptic neuron that sends the message into the ganglion, so it comes before the ganglion, and that's called a preganglionic neuron. And then we have a postsynaptic neuron that has its cell body in the ganglion that will continue on to the target tissue. That comes after the ganglion, so it's referred to as the postganglionic neuron. I know that these terms are not easy to say, but one of the real problems with this unit for most people is the terminology. So ganglionic is kind of the first big annoying jargon word that we have to get under our belt in order to move forward. But it's basically just a more specific name to describe the pre- and post-synaptic neurons here in the autonomic nervous system. And then, of course, the other big difference that I've been emphasizing is that the target tissues would be anything other than skeletal muscle. So in this example, we're talking about cardiac muscle. That's the example of the target tissue. The last complication for the autonomic nervous system is that the synapses don't have to be excitatory only. In fact, we're actually back to a situation where synapses can be excitatory or they can be inhibitory. That means I can turn something on with stimulation, or I can actively turn something off by sending an inhibitory signal. We're going to get back to this concept a little bit later towards the end of the unit. Now, just to put all of this information again into a visual, the image on the left-hand side represents the somatic nervous system, and on the right-hand side, we have the autonomic nervous system. So you can see there's a lot of similarities, right? The pictures look nearly identical to each other for the most part. They both come out of the spinal cord, but like I said, the big difference is that on the autonomic side, you have two neurons in the chain. You have the preganglionic and the postganglionic neuron.